Next up, the French philosopher Michel Foucault is known for his analysis of the tight link between surveillance and training. His book, a book usually translated in English as Discipline and Punish, is in French Surveiller et punir, which could be equally well translated to surveil and to punish. And so very naturally, close monitoring is always a key part of training and indoctrination. It's no surprise then that children are often closely monitored as we are teaching them. That is perhaps an inevitable part of raising children safely. But it also means we need to worry about whether we are training them for compliance with surveillance. As the technological capability to monitor children ever more closely becomes both a reality and widespread in use, I often wonder whether we are preparing children to accept as normal a world in which everything they do is closely scrutinized. To look at one aspect of that, the social media surveillance of students, I want to invite Rachel Levinson-Waldman of the Brennan Center.
Great, thank you so much. And Julian, that's really the perfect introduction. I'll be coming back to exactly that point near the end of my presentation. So again, my name is Rachel Levinson-Waldman. I'm Senior Counsel with the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. And as Julian said, what I'm going to be talking about today is social media surveillance of students, and especially K through 12 students. And to start this off, I want to talk just for a moment about the prevalence, the sort of deep saturation at this point that kids have online. So according to a Pew Internet study from last month, 97% of 13 to 17-year-olds in the US are on at least one major online social media platform. 95% of American teens have access to a smartphone, and 45% say that they're online almost constantly. So there is clearly a lot of content out there and a lot of time that teens and even younger kids are spending online. And with that social media presence comes social media monitoring. And these tools are sold for a variety of purposes. They're sold as preventing bullying, preventing school shootings, potential suicides, and other online threats. And maybe not surprisingly, they're also big business. So spending by public schools nationwide on nine major social media monitoring companies. You can see here, and you can see that there are sort of some spikes, some mountains and valleys. But overall, it's this pretty massive increase in spending starting in 2010 and going up to this spike. There's spikes in 2015, again in 16, 17, and this big spike in the summer of 2018, potentially driven by the shooting in Parkland, Florida. But public school districts are spending more and more money on automated social media monitoring tools. This is it's similar, reflected by keyword searches. So searches for social media monitoring in contracts between public schools and private companies, and again showing these spikes over the last several years, really significant increases, and then a major spike in 2018. So increasingly a lot of public money is being spent on these services. Now, based on these statistics, you might think that schools are getting more dangerous. But in fact, the opposite is true. Schools are actually getting safer. And while it's true that this country has a unique risk of school shootings among developed countries, and while obviously a single shooting or even a single serious bullying incident is one too many, the overall crime decline in this country holds true in schools as well. So the odds that a K through 12 student will be shot and killed at a public school are about 1 in 614 million. So by way of contrast, the odds of choking are about 1 in 3,400. In 1995, 10% of students aged 12 through 18 reported being the victim of a crime at school in the previous 6 months. In the 2015-2016 school year, just 3% of students did. So in that 20-year period, it went from 10% down to 3%, a pretty major decrease. And in general, over the last 2 decades, less than 3% of youth homicides and less than 1% of youth suicides have occurred at school. Now, of course, part of the hope with social media monitoring may be that it'll pick up risks off of school grounds as well, but by any measure, school is a pretty safe place to be. Now, the one state in the country that has legislated social media monitoring is Florida. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the shooting in Parkland, Florida last February, when Nicholas Cruz, a former student at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, shot and killed 17 students and staff members and injured 17 others. In the wake of that shooting, the Florida legislature passed a law that included the creation of an Office of State Schools within the State Department of Education. That office is required to coordinate with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to set up a centralized database to facilitate access to a pretty wide range of information, including social media data. The legislation also established a public safety commission, which recently recommended the development of protocols around social media monitoring. Doesn't look like that collection has begun quite yet, but it is likely to do so in the new year. Now, as it turned out, Nicholas Cruz actually had posted online about his intentions before the shooting. And people had taken notice. He was reported to the FBI and local police at least 3 times for disturbing posts. One call to the FBI warned that he might become a school shooter, and a separate call flagged a YouTube post in which the user had said that he wanted to become a professional school shooter, although the poster wasn't identified as Cruz until after the shooting. So while there certainly were warning signs on social media, it wasn't the case that the district was flying blind. People were seeing those warning signals and were trying to act on them. And what really failed those students wasn't a failure to see those posts. According to a review of the school district's actions that came out in August, it was more that the district itself had failed at nearly every turn to provide Cruz with the educational and support services that he needed. Nevertheless, Florida is embarking on a first-of-its-kind national experiment when it comes to social media data. So there's kind of a big question here, which is, okay, but why not, right? If a single school shooting is one too many, if social media monitoring could catch one future Nicholas Cruz, could catch one future suicidal student, why not do it? If the stakes are that high, what's the harm? And there are a lot of reasons to at least be very cautious about this kind of monitoring. So the first is a real concern about the accuracy of social media monitoring tools, and this plays out in a couple of different ways. So one way that these tools can be inaccurate is through overreach. So the fact that they're likely to pull in much more information than is actually going to be useful. By way of example, police in Jacksonville, Florida, set up a social media monitoring tool to search for keywords that were going to be related to public safety or that might indicate some risk of criminal activity. So one of the words that they set up was the word bomb, thinking if there was some kind of bomb threat, it would turn it up. Well, it turned out that there were no bomb threats that were flagged online. Instead, it was inundated with posts about things like pizza that was the bomb and photo bombs. So a lot of stuff coming in of very, very little use. The second issue is underreach, by which I mean that the kinds of risks that social media monitoring tools kind of would like to find often aren't going to appear online at all. So I mentioned earlier that Nicholas Cruz had actually posted online about his intentions and that people had reported them. So it's not clear there what the extra value of monitoring software would have been. And as it turns out, to some extent, he was the exception. So the Brennan Center did an informal survey of major school shootings, and unfortunately that is a category, major school shootings, since the Sandy Hook shooting in 2012. And there was only one other perpetrator, according to the public reporting, that had put up social media postings that strongly indicated an interest in school violence. And that was Adam Lanza, the shooter in Newtown at Sandy Hook. He had posted in discussion forums about the Columbine High School shooting, and he'd operated Tumblr accounts that were named after school shooters. Now, these postings weren't a secret. Fellow users were able to see these, and while they may not have known at the time whether to take this seriously, it's hard to imagine that now these wouldn't have been reported directly to authorities. In fact, we saw that with Nicholas Cruz, that was exactly what happened, and that individual concerned users would report this in. The online profiles of other shooters in major school shootings, which again usually get quite a lot of reporting after the fact, don't show anything that would flag them for an automated tool. So, for instance, the perpetrator of a 2014 shooting in Troutdale, Oregon, had a Facebook page showing that he liked first-person shooter and military-themed games like Call of Duty, and he also liked various knife and gun pages. So in retrospect, sure, these seem like warning signs that something were going on. But in fact, the official Facebook page for Call of Duty World War II has nearly 24 million followers. The Remington Arms Facebook page has over 1.3 million likes. So sending up a red flag about every single person who enjoys these pastimes would create a huge quantity of noise for very little signal. And finally, automated social media monitoring tools just have built-in shortcomings. So I'll flag a terrific report from the Center on Democracy and Technology called Mixed Messages, which does a lot of research on this. And as their research shows, automated monitoring tools generally work best when the posts are in English and when the tool is looking for something very concrete. They can be easily fooled by lingo, by slang, pop culture references, things like that. Maybe the best example comes from the 2015 trial of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber. During the trial, the FBI produced as evidence several quotes from his Twitter account to try to show that he himself was an extremist, that he wasn't just following his brother's orders. So for instance, he had tweeted, and this was one of the things the agent brought up, a quote that said, "I shall die young," which maybe was suggesting something about his intent, but it was also a quote from a Russian pop song. And he actually linked to the pop song in the tweet. The agent just hadn't bothered clicking on the tweet to see that this was a song lyric. Other quotes that the FBI relied on were from Jay-Z songs and South Park episodes, among other things. Social media is incredibly contextual, and neither automated tools nor often human analysts are that great at parsing out that context. The second major concern is the risk of discrimination, and this kind of comes in two forms. So the first is that the keywords themselves that the tools will be set to flag on will be discriminatory. So for instance, an ACLU report found that when the Boston Police Department set up a social media monitoring tool, the hashtags that was flagging included Black Lives Matter, Ferguson, Muslim Lives Matter, and Ummah, the Arabic word for community. Now, needless to say, these words aren't signs of a public safety threat. So these tools are only as good as the people who are using them, and there are a lot of ways to use them to further a discriminatory mindset. The second is the risk of discriminatory impact. So whatever keywords are flagged, there's going to be a huge amount of discretion in what's done with the results, including which students are brought in, who's punished by the school, and even who's subjected to criminal justice consequences. We already know that students of color at every level of schooling experience harsher discipline than white students, even for the same infractions, and even when they commit infractions at lower rates than white students. So there's a real concern that social media monitoring could contribute to the school-to-prison pipeline. I suspect folks here remember Ahmed Mohammed, the Muslim teenager who brought a homemade clock to his Dallas area high school and was then arrested on the suspicion that it concealed a bomb. He was well known at his school for bringing in electronics, tinkering, fixing other people's electronics, and he had told his teachers and the principal repeatedly that it was, in fact, a clock. This raises suspicions that the scrutiny that he was put under and his ultimate arrest was essentially grounded in Islamophobia. On the social media front, an Alabama high school paid a former FBI agent to go through students' social media accounts on the basis of anonymous tips. The district ultimately expelled over a dozen students on the basis of what he found online. 86 of the students expelled were Black, even though Blacks made up only 40% of the student body. Now, not surprisingly, where people are mistakenly identified as posing a threat because of their social media posts, the consequences can be serious. One Connecticut teenager posted on Snapchat a picture of a toy airsoft gun that resembled a real rifle. In his words, in terms of explaining why he put it up, he thought it was awesome, and he knew his friends would also think it was awesome. Another student saw the post and was worried about it, so he reported it to school officials. This does not necessarily strike me as a crazy thing to do, although, as Zach noted, this student noted, if officials had Googled the name on the side of the gun of the manufacturer, they would have seen that it was a toy gun, even though it did bear a resemblance to a real one. But instead of discussing it with him and resolving the issue, potentially with some lessons about responsible social media use and thinking before you posting, he was not only suspended for the day, but arrested for breach of peace, a misdemeanor offense. Now, because it's so hard to reliably pinpoint individual social media posts that actually indicate some kind of live threat, monitoring companies have kind of a perverse incentive. They have an incentive to some extent to sweep up everything so that they can assure their customers that they'll spot that needle in the haystack. And at the same time, they have very little reliable way of gauging their effectiveness. A 2015 investigation by the Christian Science Monitor revealed that none of the 3 major school social media monitoring companies they looked into had firm metrics for measuring effectiveness. And at least one said, well, basically we know that we've succeeded, when we get a call from a school saying that, something we sent them was interesting. So it's really a perfect storm for a mindset of more, more, more. At the same time, parents and students often know very little about these tools. Research shows that while social media monitoring companies may assume that students are assenting to being tracked by virtue of posting on public sites, students more often believe that companies are prohibited from sharing personal information with third parties. So there's a real lack of information about how these programs operate, or rather there's asymmetrical information. And finally, and this goes to Julian's point at the beginning, it's worth thinking about what it means for students to be under constant surveillance online. So as a practical matter, they may just stop posting or start posting less or in more private forums, which will simply blunt any effectiveness that these tools would have had. Maybe more concerningly, it teaches students to expect surveillance and even to anticipate an authority figure's opinion and react accordingly. Now, some of this you could say is good digital hygiene. I think we all know that something that we post publicly, we need to think before we post about what that looks like, who might see it now, and who might see it in the future. But it's not clear that it's healthy for students who are learning about citizens' role in a democracy to know that they are under that surveillance all the time and to be acting accordingly. So what does this all mean? At the very least, before a school or a school district rolls out a social media monitoring program, it's incumbent on officials to weigh the costs and the benefits and to involve parents and students in a frank discussion of what it means. And if they decide not to set forth on a monitoring program, they should remember that they are most likely not going dark, that there are a lot of concerned people out there who will spot posts and flag them. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Rachel. This does remind me, I have an acquaintance who is a science fiction writer who's more optimistic view of this. Is that this is great because we are training our children to develop habits of fairly sophisticated ComSec and counterintelligence tradecraft just to be able to have a normal childhood. And so the next generation will all be very sophisticated about evading surveillance. I suppose we'll find out.